They handed me a paper medal and a salute on the same morning I planned to disappear. Names Frank Mallory, 74, retired Marine, still flinching at the hiss of the diner's coffee machine and gripping my old USMC cap like a lifeline. Funny what a kid's thank you can do to a man who forgot how to feel ever seen. Silence turn a whole town inside out, every morning like clockwork. Frank Mallory stepped into Rosie's diner at 6:05 a.m., the doorbell jingling against the soft hum of a waking town. The warmth of sizzling bacon and burnt coffee clung to the air, chasing away the sting of Montana's November chill. Frank's boots thudded softly on the linoleum, leaving specks of road salt behind him. Without a word, he headed to the back corner booth, the one by the window that faced Main Street, where the sidewalk wore a thin crust of frost, and the American flag across at City Hall tugged gently in the wind. Lisa Hawkins wiped the counter, her cloth tracing practiced loops across the formica, but her eyes drifted as they always did toward Frank's table. Her jaw tightened imperceptibly. No one ever sat across from him. That side of the booth remained perpetually empty, like an untouchable seat at a shrine. Frank eased into the vinyl booth, his pressed flannel barely rustling. He folded his wool coat carefully beside him, then reached for the laminated menu he already knew by heart. It was just a formality, one he repeated with precision every day. Lisa appeared moments later, notepad in hand, though she didn't need it. The usual, she asked, voice clipped. He nodded. Thanks. She turned on her heel without waiting for a reply. Frank took the local news Argus from the wire rack by the napkin dispenser and unfolded it neatly. The top story was a city council dispute over snowplow budgets, but his gaze shifted to a modest square at the bottom, an ad for the upcoming Veterans Day ceremony at Lewistown Cemetery. Tiny stars and stripes flanked the text. He stared at it a moment longer than necessary. Behind the counter, a dusty portrait of a man in dress blues watched over the diner. Truman Hawkins, Marine husband, father, forever 39, in a frame kept polished by Lisa's quiet hands. Frank's eyes never met that photo. Hazel sat a few booths down, hunched over her knitting fingers, moving as if powered by muscle memory. The soft clack of her needles was the closest thing to a voice she'd made in years. Her son had died in Iraq 2005. Frank knew that kind of silence. Troy leaned against the jukebox near the front, stirring his coffee with a straw and grinning too wide. Place sure's got a haunted vibe lately, he announced loudly. Bet old ghost soldiers are lining up for pancakes. Lisa didn't flinch. She just poured fresh coffee into a waiting cup, jaw set. Frank reached for his mug and took a measured sip, eyes still on the paper. You think he sees him? Troy muttered to no one in particular, jerking his head toward Frank. Bet he talks to him too. No one laughed. Frank folded his napkin into a precise triangle, slow and sure. A movement from another lifetime. Then he placed his leather gloves beside the mug, deliberately revealing the silver glint of a Marine Corps ring. The emblem caught the light. Lisa paused mid-step, her eyes falling on it. For a second, something unreadable passed over her face. Then she turned briskly, vanishing into the kitchen with a clang of the swinging door. Outside, a school bus crept down Main Street, yellow bright against the snow-muddied curb. Its brakes squealed as it stopped at the corner. Children's voices carried faintly on the air, muffled by the diner windows, and Patsy Cline's soft twang floating from the old radio behind the counter. Frank's fingers tightened around the mug. The heat didn't quite reach his bones. Then, just as he lifted the cup again, the doorbell chimed. A breeze of cold air and wood smoke slipped in behind it. A boy, no older than 10, stepped through the doorway. His cheeks flushed pink from the cold. He didn't speak. He didn't look for a waitress. He just stared straight at Frank Mallory, eyes wide and unblinking. The boy didn't order anything. He just stood there, eyes fixed on Frank's USMC hat as if it were glowing. For a moment, the diner stood still. The soft scrape of forks on ceramic dulled the jukebox, cycled into a lull between songs, and even the door swung shut with a hesitant click behind the boy. His boots were a size too big, laced haphazardly, and his jacket sagged at the shoulders like it had known more wearers before him. Lisa's hand trembled slightly as she poured a cup of coffee behind the counter. The splash missed its mark by half an inch, coffee dribbling onto the saucer. She wiped it quickly, eyes drifting again toward Frank and the boy who hadn't moved. The silence broke when Hazel's knitting picked up its pace, click-clack-click, each motion tighter than the last. Frank looked up. Just once. His eyes met the boy's for half a second before he adjusted his hat not hurriedly but with the care of a man reacquainting himself with a uniform he no longer wore. Then he returned to his toast, slicing off the crust with deliberate precision. The boy, perhaps sensing some line had been crossed, turned and left. By the time the street lamps blinked to life, painting halos onto the sidewalk outside, Rosie's had thinned. The afternoon light waned into a soft amber gray. A snow flurry danced past the windows, sticking to the glass in delicate patterns like frost-etched feathers. Lisa moved about her routines, wiping tables long since cleared, double-checking salt shakers, pouring coffee for 2 customers too polite to leave. When the bell jingled again near dusk, she looked up expecting Troy, or perhaps the high school kids. Instead, the boy was back. Same jacket, same quiet presence, but this time he carried a notebook tucked under his arm and a stubby pencil behind one ear. He chose a stool near the far end of the counter, 3 seats down from where Frank sat, and laid the notebook in front of him. The cover was scuffed and bent, edges worn soft. Lisa glanced at it as she passed and caught a glimpse of penciled outlines. Flags, soldiers, medals. The drawings were rough but earnest. "He's staying with the McIntyres," murmured the older man nursing coffee at the corner booth. "Foster kid. Think his foster dad used to be infantry, took shrapnel, messed up his leg." Lisa nodded, eyes still on the boy. Something in his gaze stirred a memory. Jim standing at their front door in dress uniform boots, polished to mirror gloss, grinning like he didn't know he was already burning from the inside out. At the far end of the counter, the other waitress, Maggie, chatted with Dylan softly. "Want anything, hun? Is he a real soldier?" Dylan whispered back, nodding toward Frank. Lisa heard the words like a ripple across calm water. Her fingers stiffened against the edge of a plate. Frank made no sign he'd heard, but his hand paused mid-cut, the knife hovering above his eggs. Lisa walked briskly to the storeroom under the pretense of needing napkins. Inside, the air was cooler, dimmer. She reached for a high shelf and her fingers brushed against a box labeled Old Mugs. She hesitated, then pulled it down. Near the top was the one she knew would be there, faded ceramic chipped at the rim with Semper Fi painted in cursive blue. Jim's Marine Corps mug. She pressed it to her chest, breath shuddering out, and for a moment she was 24 again, watching him leave for Camp Pendleton with a suitcase and a kiss. When she stepped back into the diner, the clatter of plates had resumed. Dylan was scribbling something in his notebook, tongue poking from the corner of his mouth. Frank finished his meal, folded his napkin into another precise triangle, and stood. Before heading for the door, he picked up a piece of dry toast from his plate untouched and slid it down the counter. Not directly, just enough that Dylan, still pretending not to notice, could reach it without looking guilty. Lisa watched it all from behind the counter, hands wrapped around the marine mug she hadn't meant to bring back out. As the sky deepened into a purple haze and Maggie flipped the closed sign, Frank lingered by his booth. Lisa stepped forward, quiet, uncertain. "You served where?" she asked, her voice lower than usual. Frank didn't look up from adjusting his gloves. "Hugh." 68. The syllables hung in the air like snowflakes suspended mid-fall. Lisa nodded once, then stepped back. Patsy Cline's voice, tired and sweet, returned to the airwaves as the radio clicked into another old tune. Outside, the snow came down heavier. Frank stepped into it, the night swallowing his figure. Across the street, Dylan stood waiting under the blinking light of the bus stop. No coat hood, no mittens. Just his small figure and one hand raised in a steady salute as Frank walked by. The diner was full for the Saturday brunch rush, but suddenly silence swept the room. It had been a morning like most others. Eggs hissed on the griddle, coffee flowed with no end in sight, and the bell above the front door barely had time to rest before ringing again. Rosie's Diner was bursting at the seams. Cowboys in worn denim mothers with fussy toddlers and retirees dissecting the town council's latest missteps over stacks of pancakes. The air smelled of bacon and warmth, the kind that clung to flannel and made the windows fog up in soft halos. Lisa was at her usual station behind the counter, sliding plates with practiced ease and shouting back to the kitchen for more hash browns. She hadn't seen Frank come in, but there he was now, settled in his usual booth by the window, steam rising from his cup. But today he wasn't in his normal pressed flannel. Today Frank wore his USMC dress cap. It rested neatly on his head, perfectly aligned, its brim casting a modest shadow across his brow. He didn't look any taller, but somehow he took up more space, his presence commanding but not loud. No one seemed to comment, but heads turned. A few whispers rose and fell like snow flurries barely settling. Lisa caught herself watching him. Her own words from earlier that week echoed uninvited in her mind. Kids today wouldn't know sacrifice if it bit them. At the time, she'd said it more from frustration than judgment. But now, looking at Frank, something about it didn't sit right. The bell rang again. Dylan stepped in, cheeks flushed red from the morning frost, his small hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. He wore the same two big boots, but his back was straight, his eyes focused. He carried something in one hand, small square folded. He didn't wait for the line or glance at the pastry case. Instead, he marched quietly but firmly straight to Frank's booth. The clatter of utensils dimmed. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Even the kitchen noise seemed to muffle as if the room were taking a collective breath. Dylan stopped in front of Frank, squared his shoulders, and raised his hand in a crisp, deliberate salute. "Thank you for serving, sir." The silence thickened, deepened, then wrapped around the room like a wool blanket. Only the jukebox dared to speak a low, steady Johnny Cash tune, humming about promises and long roads home. Frank's eyes flicked up. He didn't smile, didn't flinch. For a long second, he simply stared at the boy, then, with the slow reverence of a man remembering more than he wished to, lifted his cap. His hand trembled just slightly, but he removed it and held it against his chest in return. Dylan lowered his salute, reached out, and placed the card on the table. It was made from a torn cereal box, edges uneven. In the center, written in blocky pencil lines, were two words: Semper Fi. From the far corner of the room, Troy's voice broke the stillness. Where'd he learn that TV? Lisa turned so fast her apron whipped. "No," she said, eyes narrowing. "From his father." Troy shrank back into his seat. A few patrons glanced his way, but most returned their eyes to the boy in the Marine. At the corner booth, Hazel did something no one had seen in years. She stopped knitting. Then slowly she pressed her palms to the tabletop and stood. Her spine curved with age, but she was tall in that moment, taller than memory had allowed. Lisa moved behind the counter with purpose now. She reached for a clean plate, scooped scrambled eggs, added 2 sausage links and toast just the way Dylan had watched Frank eat. She placed it gently before the boy who blinked but said nothing. "It's on the house," Lisa said softly. Frank, still holding the card, turned to Lisa. His voice, when it came, was gravel, worn smooth. "It's been a long time since someone looked me in the eye like that." The diner exhaled. Conversations resumed quieter this time. Someone clapped once, maybe twice, before thinking better of it. Hazel remained standing, eyes on Frank. Then she spoke. "My David wore that same ring." The air stopped again, but this time not in silence, more like awe. Her voice was papery, unused, but clear. Frank looked toward her slowly, eyes narrowing in recognition or memory or something in between. No one moved, no one dared. Only the radio carried on softly singing about a man in black who understood pain and pride alike. Snow fell steady outside, but inside Rosie's diner it was Frank's voice that froze everyone in place. He hadn't spoken more than a dozen words on any morning since Lisa took over the place, but this time something had shifted. Maybe it was the card still tucked into his coat pocket. Maybe it was the way Hazel had said David aloud, crumbling the invisible wall that had encased her for 17 years. Or maybe it was the date Veterans Day morning, November 11th, and the hush that blanketed Lewistown, Montana like a collective exhale waiting for meaning. The flags along Main Street flapped gently in the wind, tied to lampposts and fences, their colors a little muted beneath the gray skies. On Rosie's front window, a handwritten sign said in bold red ink, "Free meal for vets today only. Thank you." Inside the old Marine mug Lisa had found earlier in the week, now sat on the center shelf behind the counter directly beside the framed portrait of Truman in dress blues. Their placement felt intentional, even reverent. Frank stirred his coffee, watching the swirl of cream spiral into the dark. Lisa poured another cup without being asked. She didn't speak, but her hand no longer trembled. Then Frank said it just loud enough for those nearest to hear, but the effect was tidal. Lost 2 brothers in Hugh. Never buried them. Just radio silence. It wasn't the volume. It was the weight of it, the way the syllables dropped like stones into a quiet lake rippling outward. The sound of forks pausing mid-air, the hush of a back booth conversation that died on a whisper. Even the old jukebox midway through an Elvis gospel track seemed to lower its voice. Lisa stood still a moment, then stepped around the counter. She didn't ask if she could. She just sat down across from him, his usual booth, the one no one had ever dared occupy opposite him. "My husband, Jim. He came back," she said, voice soft but steady. "But he never really came home." Frank didn't look surprised. He just nodded once, like that pain needed no explanation between them. Hazel sat in her corner booth, her knitting fallen slack on her lap, hands folded as though in prayer. Eyes closed, she breathed in deeply, then opened them looking toward the ceiling tiles. "David," she whispered. "David Leonard Coates, Corporal, Fallujah." The diner didn't cheer. It didn't erupt in applause or standing ovations. It simply listened. No clink of silverware, no buzz of cell phones. Just the muted world of snowfall and grief finding its name. Troy, sitting alone at the counter, had nothing to say. His usual smirk gone, he stirred his coffee until it went cold. Frank's fingers moved slowly to his right hand, where the Marine Corps ring had glinted on his finger every morning since anyone could remember. He twisted it once, slid it free. The light from the window caught the emblem, an eagle globe and anchor set into old steel. He stood his legs, deliberate spine held like it once carried orders down jungle trails. He walked the few paces toward Hazel, her eyes blinking fast behind welling tears. Gently, Frank reached down and placed the ring into her hand. "For David," he said. Her knuckles, thin and trembling, closed around the metal as if it were a relic, her chin quivering. A small sound escaped her, a breath or maybe a thank you, but it didn't need translation. Lisa's lips parted slightly, watching Frank return to his seat with a reverence usually reserved for altars. She looked at her own hands, still for once. Not curled or clenched or shaking. A bell above the door jingled and Frank instinctively looked up, but it wasn't a customer. The door remained closed. From where Lisa stood, she had a clear view through the wide front windows to Main Street beyond. There outside in the cold, Dylan moved from pole to pole wearing a red scarf and mismatched gloves. He had a small roll of Scotch tape clutched in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. With solemn precision, he pressed each drawing to the light poles hand-drawn. American flags, each one colored by a child's hand. Crayons bled into the edges. Stars, uneven stripes too thick or too thin, but the intention was clear. He stepped back after each one, admiring it for just a second, before moving on to the next. Inside the diner, no one moved. The clink of coffee cups resumed, but quieter. Conversation returned, hushed and careful. Frank sat with both hands around his cup, staring at the old marine mug behind the counter. His cap sat beside him on the table now, not on his head. It didn't need to be. By noon, Rosie's diner had more veterans than seats, and not a single person complained. The place buzzed with a reverence that didn't need announcing. Outside, snowflakes clung to the corners of windshields and piled gently on the hoods of trucks parked along Main Street. Inside, the heat from the kitchen fogged up the windows, framing the warm clamor like a snow globe holding the town's quiet heart. Frank Mallory, who once sat alone in the far booth, now found his table already claimed by two young men in desert fatigues and a third wearing a battered Navy windbreaker. Someone, no one could say who, had left a folded copy of the News Argus at the corner of the table as if marking the space in his honor. He didn't mind. Instead, Frank nodded at the younger vets, then made his way to the counter. His usual seat was open, though someone had slid a plate of toast there without a word. Lisa caught his eye as she poured coffee behind the counter and smiled warm, unhurried, the kind that made you feel seen. "Try the new special?" she asked. Frank glanced at the chalkboard near the register. Frank's breakfast, $6. Free with any war story. He huffed gently through his nose, the closest thing to a laugh anyone could remember. "No stories today," he said. "Just coffee." "Suit yourself," Lisa replied, her eyes dancing. She poured him a fresh cup and leaned on the counter. Behind her, Truman's portrait held vigil beside the old marine mug. Above both, a new brass plaque caught the morning light. The engraving was simple: "To those who sat alone, so we wouldn't have to." Hazel sat at her usual booth, though her knitting lay forgotten on the vinyl beside her. Dylan, cheeks rosy from the cold, sat beside her, tongue pressed to his teeth in concentration as he drew. Colored pencils spilled from a plastic pencil box, and his small hands moved with deliberate care. "It's Mr. Frank," he whispered, showing Hazel the sketch, an older man standing beneath an American flag, saluting no one and everyone all at once. Hazel's eyes misted, and she placed a gnarled hand on Dylan's shoulder. She said nothing, but the quiet squeeze of her fingers carried enough. From the back table, Troy watched. He hadn't spoken much that day, hadn't cracked jokes or interrupted conversations. Instead, he stood, walked to the counter, and slipped a 20 under his untouched plate of pancakes. As he passed Frank, he paused, then, in a gesture as plain as breath, nodded once and walked out into the snow. Lisa saw it. She didn't say anything either, just picked up the bill, smiled to herself, and tucked it into the tip jar. Two men on motorcycles rolled in around one snow, clinging to their shoulders like silver epaulets. One had a patch that read "First Cav," the other "Caisson Survivor." They were loud in the way vets are when among their own, laughing, pointing, warming their hands near the register. "We heard about this place," the taller one said, eyeing the chalkboard. "About the kid who saluted a ghost." Lisa chuckled softly. "He's not a ghost, just hard to see if you're not looking the right way." The bikers took their coffee near the window eyes, scanning the room like radar. One of them tipped his cap toward Frank. Frank this time nodded back. Behind the counter, Lisa wiped a spot on the wall just below Hazel's photo of David. She held a small, faded button in her palm, a relic she hadn't touched in years. It had the USO logo and a bent pin. Jim had worn it to their last town dance. She fastened it beside David's frame and stepped back. "Looks right there," she said aloud, though no one was near. Frank noticed. He rose, bringing his mug with him, and slowly walked over. For a moment, he simply looked at the photo, the button, the layers of memory pressed into that small space. Then he whispered, "Thank you," and returned to his seat. Lisa began keeping a guest book that day. She laid it open near the cash register with a pen tethered by string. Veterans signed with years and units, some with hometowns, others with nothing more than initials. A few pages in someone had written, "For the ones who stayed quiet. We remember." Hazel remained near the window, Dylan now curled up beside her, his head resting against her woolen coat. She reached down, took his drawing, and folded it carefully into her purse. Frank stood slowly, joints protesting the weight of 74 winters. He looked toward the boy, then to Lisa. "Tomorrow," he said, voice low, but certain, "I'd like to show Dylan the flag ceremony." Lisa nodded. "I'll make him a thermos," she said, "hot cocoa, with those tiny marshmallows." Frank smiled, a real one this time, and stepped back into the cold. Snow fell thick around him, but his footsteps left a clear path behind. Dưới đây là chương 6 được viết đúng theo prompt name và dàn ý, điều mà, không lập nội dung, không dùng heading, giống văn radio, ấm áp, độ dài 500 ký tự. The next morning, the town square felt sacred, like every footstep echoed through time. Snow blanketed the ground in a hushed reverence. The wooden benches along Main Street had been brushed clean by gloved hands hours earlier. A soft hush held over the gathering, like the breath before prayer. The flagpole near City Hall stood still, its rope swaying gently in the cold air as dawn's first pink brushed the tops of the mountains in the distance. Frank Mallory stood in full dress uniform. The creases in his trousers were sharp boots buffed to a quiet shine, medals pinned with care. Each movement he made was deliberate. Age had stiffened his knees, but dignity carried his frame straight. He stood beside Dylan, who wore a paper medal clipped to his thrift store jacket. A ribbon of blue yarn held it in place. Hazel's doing, perhaps. Frank leaned slightly toward the boy, not needing to speak loudly in the stillness. Each fold he began means something. First is life. Second, belief. Third, remembrance. Dylan watched the flag in Frank's hands, eyes wide, pencil tucked behind his ear as always. Fourth, Frank continued folding with slow precision, is for those who wore the uniform. Snowflakes drifted across their shoulders. The small crowd gathered around them, maybe 24. A few old veterans, some children with parents holding styrofoam cups. A police cruiser idled in the distance, engine humming faintly. Lisa stood to the side, flanked by a folding table holding 2 thermoses and a tray of homemade muffins. Steam curled from each paper cup she handed out. Her fingers were red from the cold, but she hadn't stopped smiling since she arrived. Hazel was wrapped tightly in a wool blanket patterned in olive and khaki, her son's army issue. Her eyes were on the flag, but her hands moved quietly in her lap. A scarf was beginning to take shape, red, white, and blue yarn weaving together in quiet rhythm. As the final fold took shape, Frank's voice was barely more than a whisper. "The last one," he said, "is for memory." He stepped back and raised his arm in a salute. Sharp, steady, proud, for the first time in 50 years. The flag rose slowly as Lisa stepped forward, her voice cutting softly through the morning air. "Some wounds don't bleed," she said, meeting the eyes of those before her. "But they leave marks all the same. We carry them quietly like medals we didn't ask for. But when we see each other, really see each other, maybe they weigh a little less." Dylan stepped forward, his breath coming out in short, puffy clouds. "I made this," he said, lifting the paper medal and pressing it into Frank's hands. "For being brave in silence." Frank didn't speak right away. He looked down at the crinkled edges, the crayon scribbles, the wobbly letters. Then with care he slipped the medal into the inside pocket of his coat. He removed his USMC cap and walked to the base of the flagpole. "For the ones who never made it back," he said, and set the cap down with both hands. Snow continued to fall, gentle, steady, like breath from the sky. Later that morning, back at the diner, sunlight caught on the window glass, casting long streaks of gold across the vinyl booths. The bell above the door jingled once, then settled. A new sign had appeared at the booth where Frank used to sit alone, reserved for heroes. Lisa moved through the diner with quiet purpose. She paused to tuck an envelope into a small donation jar near the register. A note taped to the front read, "Hot meals for cold vets." Coins and folded bills were already gathering inside. Hazel sat with her scarf nearly halfway done, the needles clicking softly as she added red to the field of blue. Dylan was in the corner sketching again, tongue between his teeth focused. This time he drew not just Frank, but the whole ceremony, the flag, the crowd, the cap at the pole's base. Outside, the town moved slowly, but something had shifted. People held doors for one another a beat longer. They looked up from their phones more often. Snow piled on windowsills and rooftops, but inside Rosie's warmth had taken root. Lisa stood behind the counter wiping a clean mug without urgency. Her eyes drifted to Truman's portrait, to Jim's USO button to the plaque. Then she turned toward the window. Frank was walking by Dylan beside him, both figures framed in soft winter light. She smiled more to herself than anyone and whispered, "Thank you, Jim." He made it. Some mornings it's not the flag or the uniform that makes us pause, but the quiet man who finally stood tall and the boy who reminded him how. In a town once too busy to notice a small salute stirred hearts long left in silence. Kindness, especially the kind given without expectation, ripples further than we imagine, soft as snowfall, steady as memory. Like a porch light left on in the fog, compassion has a way of guiding us home. If this story touched something in you, maybe today's the day to thank someone who once stood alone.